The first point to make is that the 12 of the 17 SDGs have to be implemented in cities. And a lot of this involves investment, it involves capacity building, it involves resources of many different kinds. And so the whole financial package, or foundation for this, needs to be mobilized somehow. So I think this is one of the preconditions. The SDGs, in my judgment, are good. There's a good agreement on the what, but there's almost nothing about the how. And with the how comes the question of what are the resources to be applied. I don't believe that the aid system, the international agencies, have the resources to cover this at all. And I think, I remember years back at one point someone was making an estimate of what was the annual investment in infrastructure, in urban infrastructure, by developing countries, and it was something on the order of 150 billion a year, and at that time the World Bank was providing 6, right? And so that sort of should have kept everybody in a kind of in a more humble mood and realizing that it wasn't going to come from these institutions. So at this point, I think the resources have to come from every place. They have to come as some kind of combination of small but catalytic resources from the international agencies, but a lot from the global private sector, a lot from national and local public finance. So it really requires measures at every single level in order to get more resources going. Well, I think the first point on that is that there's a basic misperception by national governments of the role of cities in their whole future and their whole economic situation. Because we know now that at least 70% of GDP in all countries is coming from urban-based economic activities. So it's not an exaggeration to say that if cities are not productive, the economic and social futures and political futures of all these countries is not very promising. So if you know that a large share of your future depends on cities functioning, you better start allocating resources in that direction. So the first issue is a political technical judgment about the importance of resources coming from these places. In the present situation, the performance at the urban level is insufficient. We need some kind of an urban social compact which would increase local and urban institutional performance, and that we need that performance criteria which can give confidence to global capital to be able to land. Well, I think there has to be much more control on both the revenue and the expenditure side. On the revenue side, there has to be much more effort, it has to be much more serious, it has to be strategic, and national governments have to not just think about what are traditionally local taxes, but think about what's the combination of local and national taxes that would make sense to finance something that's 70% of the economy of the country. And I think that probably means thinking about sales and income tax and other things like that, also generating revenue at the local level. I don't believe that telling the local governments that their future is going to be based on property taxes is going to go very far. I think property taxes are highly inefficient and expensive to collect, and I don't think that that's going to be a reasonable outcome. I would say that national urban policy needs to have as an objective local economic development. And that presumes that there is in fact a commitment and that can be backed up by some resources as required, but that the nation requires local prosperity. And prosperity and productivity is going to come from local places. It's not going to come from some abstraction called the nation, right? And it's going to be in real terms, whether it's in Mumbai or some other place or Hyderabad. It's from a real place. It's not from from the cloud, right? But here I come back again to this notion of the urban social contract. The local has to prove that it's credible, that it has to agree that it's going to tighten up on certain things, and it's got to convince people. You've got to convince its own electorate and its communities that better administration will lead to long-term better quality of life and better results for everybody. If we assume that we're not just talking about water systems or roads or traditional urban infrastructure, but we're thinking about things which affect health and education and social protection, response to climate change, all of these things. I think we're in a very different situation. And the case that I've been thinking of a lot about now is this question of Zika in Latin America, where people are realizing that if in fact this becomes a large-scale epidemic, what will happen is that the care of damaged children will lead to a reduction in the number of wage earners and by households, so we'll see a new generation of urban poverty. And so we almost need an insurance policy at the level of the city against Zika, which I think people would understand, and I think people would agree to pay a certain Zika tax, whereas they may not be prepared to pay a climate change tax yet. So the cross-sectoral character of the SDGs must have some opportunities there that we have to discover. I think there's going to be a aha moment, and the aha moment will be about the discovery of interdependence. I recently was in some discussions with the CAF, the new Latin American Development Bank, and they said that the subject, what they were interested in, was productive transformation. And I said, well, what sector is that? Right? And they said, well, that's got a little bit of people, and it's got some infrastructure, it's got some productive investment, it's got industry. And so they began to think about this in a much more integrated way. I've had recent discussions in the UN Economic Commission for Latin America in Santiago. They're talking about in the same language. So I think there's a moment where things are beginning to change. I think that one of the questions is whether these organizations are interested in being innovative at this point. How hungry they are for new customers, how they conceptualize their line of business. My impression is that the CAF really is interested in this, and my impression also is that the new bank in China is also interested in that. It's notable that you don't see as much activity coming out of Washington, right? That neither the World Bank or the IDB seem to be as active and proactive, in fact, and innovative on this. I think the role of technology in this will be very interesting. There's an interesting comparison that I've come across in the last several months. I was working in Bogota, where it turns out 90% of the enterprises are under 10 employees. That means there's no room for economies of scale, low returns, no investment in technology. So firm size is a problem in production and in employment. You come to New York, it turns out that 60% of the new startups since the year 2000 are under 5 employees. So what's the difference? It's not that size is what matters, but what matters is infrastructure and connectivity and human capital investment. So productivity is related to other things. And I think we have to kind of move more in towards this direction of what we're seeing in places like Brooklyn here in New York, which is suggesting more about the future. In Mexico has 5 million empty housing units surrounding Mexico City. So we have people without housing and housing without people, right? And so the lack of regulation of the developers and of the private sector demonstrates that Mexico's housing policy has really been disastrous. The number is 6 million in Brazil, it's 4 million in Argentina. And so we're coming out with a book now which basically says that housing policy has undermined urban policy. And I believe that part of that's related to the global financial sector, because this is some money that's landing in these places and allowing for outcomes which are not urban outcomes, they're housing outcomes, and bad housing outcomes. And that's one of the things that, for example, I think is terribly weak in the new urban agenda. The regulatory function. There's almost no mention of regulatory functions. There's almost no mention of markets. All right? And that's a pretty silly thing to do. That's a big mistake. So the question, the Mexico example would show you that even though after Habitat 2, Mexico put in heavy decentralization and all kinds of institutional reforms, but they still were unable to regulate their markets. And you come up with this terribly wasteful situation. In fact, it's even worse because they ended up using public resources. They used the Social Security funds. The workers' payments have gone into financing this housing. I think that we need to think about regulation. I think there has to be a national perspective on regulation. But one of the things that we really have not seen in decentralization in general is the decentralization of the regulatory function. And maybe the regulation, we really have to think about a different form of regulation or different jurisdictions for regulation to govern local markets so that these are not so generalized as not to be meaningful in local places and real ecologies, and where people can manage them on the ground. I don't really see big improvements in the water sector. I think the water sector is a little stuck, and it's dangerous because we know that the marginal cost of water is going up in almost every city in the world, so that we've got to move to a different approach on water. But the institution, there doesn't seem to be that much reform, and the promises of privatization by the big companies absolutely did not work. On the privatization of roads, people are prepared to pay for tolls for some of these roads because the traffic situation has certainly become disastrous in many places. But that doesn't solve the urban transport problem, and we need much more public transport and public transport systems. Let's say we take a city like Buenos Aires. They have a big architecture school. They produce 28,000 architects, come out of there. But these people don't learn about environment. They certainly don't learn about public health. They don't learn about enough about the infrastructure, right? Their housing and housing design may be some of the best in the world, but they're not urbanists. I'm particularly interested in how urban practice is increasing exclusion, right? I mean, if you think about it, a lot of urban practice is about definitions, about definition of spaces, definition of jurisdictions, of eligibility criteria. And every time we talk about definitions, we talk about distinctions and exclusions. So we need to think about a different kind of urban practice, which is much more integrated. They have to help in the estimation of what are the resources required to service any particular urban area. What do we need to do? Right? And to build the consensus among the institutions and the political forces that if we have to tax at a 30% level instead of a 20% level, we should do that, but this is what we expect to get out of it. That part of the job is the mobilization of resources and the management of expectations to needs and all these things. So it's a much more holistic kind of judgment. And I also think that's absolutely essential if one imagines the prospect of climate change and the need for infrastructure to mitigate and later for adaptation. So I think that this kind of a judgment, it's somebody who is much broader than the traditional, microsurgeon who works, a microeconomist who can tell you about the rate of return on a housing project. We have an interesting dissertation, for example, being done on Karachi. It turns out that everyone will say, well, Karachi has a very poor urban governance, the public institutions don't work very well, and yet Karachi recently has been called one of the most charitable cities in the world. Okay, so where's all this coming from? And what are the practices? And in fact, when we look at what the practices are, we see that they are highly integrated, right? But they're out of the formal governance structure. Right. So now the question is how would you train for that? How would you modify curricula? How would you get people to think about a kind of urban practice which is much broader? And I think, again, the Zika problem is a good example of that. Is it a public health problem? Is it an urban infrastructure problem? Or is it an urban economics problem? I mean, it becomes all of those things. And so this is a new urban practice. This is no longer architects. This is the architects. Yeah, they're helpful and for limited in a limited way. But we need people who can cross these disciplinary boundaries, who can see the whole. Right? It's almost like urban practitioners, in fact, which are aware of these range of things. I think that would be important.